I'll touch on the more local and personal steps that can be taken. So the first question that I'd like to pose here, which is a question in many people's minds, is change in national monetary policy even possible? And I would say yes. In fact, it's inevitable. Change is occurring as money systems evolve more completely into digital currencies, where the tokens representing money exist only as entries in computers. The question for us is what precise changes will be made and whether they will serve public interest and Quaker values, or will they only exacerbate the present problems of inequity? Change is being pushed by turmoil in the financial system, bank failures, inflation, the appearance of privately issued digital currencies. All of these are in fact challenging the present bank money system. Proposals for change are emerging. There are bills in Congress, the eCash Act, Public Banking Act, National Infrastructure Act, the $1 trillion coin proposal, and others. Academic papers are now coming out calling for change. Conferences are being held at high levels, and these are opportunities to learn and to make input. But to do that, we have to educate ourselves about our current system and alternatives. And so that's the purpose of the COD and our purpose in sharing with you today. So let me at this point go to screen sharing. So in thinking then about directions to go, there are three particularly essential questions. And now, before I say that, let me remind you again that when we speak of the monetary system, we are speaking about a fairly simple system, namely the system by which money is created. We tend to think of monetary as everything having to do with money. But the fiscal system, which has to do with the way pre-existing money is spent and flows in the system, that's a fiscal issue. That's a financial issue. That's the financial sector. The monetary process is the process of creating money and regulating the money supply through that process. Okay? So we're talking about the monetary system here. We talk about it because the monetary system, in fact, has an enormous impact on the initial stage of the distribution of resources of money. So in thinking about these questions, we want to think about whether money creation should be by private agents as it is now, or by a public entity or public entities. We want to be thinking about whether it should be introduced into circulation primarily by lending, as it is now, or by some combination of lending, spending, and giving. And we'll also want to keep in mind the possibility of multiple currencies. So in our COD, we asked ourselves the question of what properties or characteristics would a monetary system have to have in order to serve the public and be consistent with Quaker testimonies. We kept in mind the 4 we seeks of FCNL. And this is the list we came up with. This is on the next 3 slides cover this list. So what we need in a monetary system is transparency, accountability, and customer protection. That's pretty conventional.
Your slides aren't showing.
Oh, they're not?
I see them.
I also see them.
I see them. Paul, I think they're enabled and other people are seeing them. There may be something about your particular program.
I'm on an iMac and or a MacBook Pro, and I see this, all the slides.
Okay. So I
Oh,
hope,
John, I guess I would encourage you to keep going, and Paul, if you continue to have trouble, I'm the technical person now, so you might send a message to me with the chat if you continue to have trouble, and we'll see if we can problem solve on it. Okay, John, I would invite you to.
okay.
Or if the material has been posted to Google Drive, it might be useful to download a PDF.
Thanks.
Okay, so back to these characteristics that have to be built into a monetary system for it to serve. Transparency, accountability, customer protection, and it must provide a money supply to match the needs of society and the economy. And the system must do some things. It must do these things. It must benefit the many, not just the few. It must reduce poverty and reduce the excess accumulation of wealth that occurs in private hands. Both of those things. It's got to improve economic stability because the instability hurts the poorest in society. It's essential that it is not dependent upon continuous growth, that it's able to accommodate levels of economic activity constrained by planetary limits. And it's important that it be able to permit and foster social and environmental justice and earth care. Now, there are two specific design features that came out of our considerations. And that is that the money system must permit the money supply to increase without increasing public or private debt. Steve talked yesterday about this, the mounting debts, and we're all aware of them. But the money system, as Paul described, links an increase in money supply to increase in debt, because all money is created by lending, which creates debt. Secondly, any profit gained from issuing the money must serve public and community benefits rather than primarily private benefits. So those are what we came up with. And let me say that this process that has brought about these things is a continuing process. It's a work in progress and open to input on this. But the question is, what are the implications of these features? Well, one of the implications of these features is that they eliminate the current system. Current system does not do the four things we're asking a money system to do. It doesn't benefit the many. It doesn't provide economic stability. It doesn't foster earth care. It is entirely dependent upon growth for the little stability which it has. And it violates both specific design features. It can't increase the money supply without increasing debt. And it doesn't put the profit from money creation into serving public or community benefits. Well, what changes then do we need in the money system that can provide these desired features? Well, what follows from this very clearly is that money must be created publicly, not by private banks. And by saying it has to be created publicly, at the national level, to be publicly created means created by government. And that's not radical. The Constitution calls for money to be coined, that is to say, created by Congress. And the second feature is that money must be spent, or to some extent given, into circulation, rather than just lent into circulation. Otherwise, the debt goes up as the money supply goes up. Well, the question is, how can this be done in the practical world of legislation and so on? And there are proposals that are out there. There was a proposal that came out back in the 30s. Actually, Paul Douglas, a Quaker, was part of the group that put forth what was called the Chicago Plan to get the nation's economy back on track. And it essentially proposed that government should create money and not the banks. This was not accepted at the time. It came close. It had some support in Washington. But I think the World War II kind of occurred and people lost track of the issue about money. Now, that was taken up, that Chicago Plan was taken up by a group called the Alliance, the American Monetary Institute, which came up with a piece of legislation. It was called the National Emergency Employment Defense Act of 2011, 2012. And that was introduced into Congress by Dennis Kucinich from Ohio, but it didn't get out of committee. And now there's an organization called the Alliance for Just Money, which has brought the NEED Act up to date, and it's in the form of the American Monetary Reform Act. And that is an ongoing process by that group. And what that would do is to shift money creation from private banks to government. And it specifies how it's to be done. Now, there's another proposal that has come out recently in 2021 by Solly Omarova. You may remember that name because Solly Omarova was President Biden's first nominee for the office of the Controller of the Currency. And she put out a paper in 2021 called the People's Ledger. And it too shifts money creation from private banks to the Federal Reserve banks. The Federal Reserve banks are privately owned, but they're established by the Federal Reserve Act. The Federal Reserve Board of Governors is a governmental organization, and that's the controller over the Federal Reserve banks. So both of these proposals then make this shift from private creation of money to public creation of money. Let me back up a little bit and say that the way the NEED Act and indeed the American Monetary Reform Act have this transition done is it essentially has money created under the direction of Congress, because Congress has that authority, but it would be done by the Treasury Department as coins are now produced under the Treasury Department. And the whole process would be guided by a monetary authority, which would be established by the Act as an independent agency to essentially analyze the appropriate amount of money to be introduced in any given year based on extensive economic analyses of the country. And then money created in this way would be distributed through a combination of channels. In part, it would be distributed to the states to use for infrastructure. In part, it would be government spending at the national level for such things as climate change problems or whatever. And thirdly, possibly a citizen's dividend, which is, of course, the most distributed way, most decentralized way that money can enter the system, kind of a form of universal basic income. Well, anyway, this approach stands in the tradition of the greenbacks that were issued under the Lincoln administration. Now, the proposal put forth by Solly Omarova is to have the money created only by the Federal Reserve. And that money could then be loaned or effectively granted to the government as a revenue source for addressing climate change and today's other socioeconomic demands. So either one of these proposals would end money creation by bank lending and provide government with the resources of new money to be used for public purposes. We would no longer be paying banks interest on all of the money in circulation. It would affect lending patterns and reduce debt, both public and private. And the need for borrowing by government would be reduced or eliminated. The growth imperative imposed by the current system of money creation by banks would be ended. And as growth leveled off, any loan defaults arising in the banking system would not threaten the payment system for reasons I'll describe in a moment. And that has to do with the fact that transaction accounts would no longer be involved in bank lending. So what would this then mean for in terms of banks and accounts? Well, what it would mean is that there would be checking accounts, transaction accounts, they're called in this literature for the most part, and that would be for the payment system. So that's would function like checking accounts do now. There would also be accounts called investment or savings accounts. And of course, there are these kind of accounts in existence now too. But this would be the source of money that banks would use for bank lending, not out of the transaction accounts. So what it would mean is that the banks would be operating like investments banks do now, taking in money and lending that money out. And that's different from the way it works now, of course, with banks using essentially having the lending process linked to our checking account, to transaction accounts, which is currently the case. So these checking accounts, on the other hand, would have money available on the checking accounts would have money available on demand from the depositors, and it would be held by the banks, but not available for bank use in lending. And therefore, the demands of depositors could always be met, and bank runs would end, providing more stability to the economic system. Now, it may seem premature to advocate for legislation for this radical change in the monetary system. And there are partial measures that have been proposed. And one is public banking. Public banking is the idea that banks could be owned by the public, by a municipality, by a state, as in the case of North Dakota now. And that way people and governments of municipalities and states could keep their money local, not send it off to Wall Street. And that money could be used to direct loans for local needs. And of course, the profits from lending would support public interest because it was a publicly owned institution. So that's one. There are other proposals out there. Some of them interesting, like the issuance of $1 trillion coin that comes up with it at every debt ceiling crisis. And we can address these in question and answer or the interest session, interest group later on, if there is interest in doing so. But if monetary change is to be enacted, the public will have to demand it. That requires public education, and it may also require the collapse of the current system, accompanied by economic hard times. Sometimes change doesn't occur without crises. But for Friends to have an input through its lobbying arm, FCNL, Friends will have to educate themselves and ask FCNL to become familiar with the kind of material that we presented here. That will require more presentations at yearly meetings and a willingness to consider the matter in monthly meetings. And we invite your help with that. Well, let me make a couple of comments here about local money systems. When national money systems have failed in the past, as they have historically on numerous occasions, local currency systems have often been generated. The Schumacher Center lists 10 models for local currencies, And I mentioned earlier yesterday I mentioned examples, including time banks like Ithaca Hours and convertible paper currencies like Berkshire's of Western Massachusetts. And I want to mention one other one, and that is what's called local economic trading systems or mutual credit systems. And I'm going to quote a little bit from the Schumacher Center here about these systems. The description is that they're created as simple debt and credit systems. They're denominated in the national currency. And consumers wishing to purchase goods or services offered through these LETS programs would simply phone in a transaction to a central coordinator, and their LETS account would be debited and the seller's account credited. Producers would then spend their credits with other members in the system. The system was essentially self-regulated, with members issuing their own line of credit at the point of making a purchase. These programs are by far the most popular local currency systems throughout the world. And they have even spawning various adaptations. And now, interestingly enough, facilitated by customized computer programs that have been developed for use by these programs. These programs, the LETS development has been slow in the United States. However, the IRS law recognizes these programs as barter systems, and as such requires system managers to report the total value of transactions for each individual to the IRS. And this kind of management has proven costly and burdensome for startup systems, discouraging broad replication in this country up until this point. But what I want to do is I want to share something else with you, namely a glimpse into a mutual credit system that is functioning. It's functioning in Kenya. It's not the only one that's functioning, but I want to share this to give you a little glimpse of one of these systems. Okay, let's go back here. And now I will share this. Share. Oh, wait a minute. I have to back up. Share. And I have to share the sound. That's what I have to remember to do. Now I can share this. And can you see that now?
Yes.
Okay, good. I think I can bring this up and see if I can have it go.
Community inclusion currencies
Yep, we hear it.
are a product of a financial instrument that's created by a commons or a community that comes together to share their resources together, and they're creating a voucher or a credit obligation that represents their committed goods and services with each other. So just like you have airtime credit, right? That's credit redeemable for a service from the telecom, or a bus ticket is redeemable for a bus ride, right? So they're creating a voucher redeemable for a group of services generally, or a mutual credit amongst themselves. And when that starts to flow, like an invoice moving around the community, it starts to act as a medium of exchange. And in that sense, it can act like a currency. It can be inclusive. It can grow out into the community around it. And it can sort of define, in some ways, a type of a community that's there to share amongst each other. Mostly we work with communities around games. So first is a lot of resource mapping. So they'll look at their community and they'll say, well, what goods and services do we offer each other? And we do a lot of exercises to sort of represent that as an uteo. This is a winnowing basket. And when there's a lot of goods and services, these rice in this case, or beans, can represent the goods and services of the community. And so they're creating an amount of these relative to their ability to actually provide those services. So we work with them to basically audit their current resources, and we work with the village elders and assistant chiefs and chiefs to also audit and verify that there are tomatoes and school fees and haircuts and whatnot behind that. The commitments to them are real. And then we create these credit obligations with the community, and they're distributed out to the community members holding the basket here, or the washika dao, the stakeholders. And they can begin to trade that amongst themselves. And so in one way, it's just facilitating offers and wants to connect with each other. So when there's no national currency, or when national currency is really low, this fills a gap in that group. And then they can also take these and offer them, just like an airtime credit would be offered, or a bus ticket would be offered, outside to the community, and say, would you over here help us with our community garden? And in return, you can use these back for the vegetables from the community garden or other goods and services among us.
It's a much longer piece that, and I can provide the link for you to follow that. It's called the Serafu network. But anyway, in closing, then, in terms of what I want to say today, is that we need to keep in mind the national system and ways that we can influence its evolution to serve us. But we don't know what's going to happen. And we need to encourage this kind of local currency kind of a thing, where the currency arises out of the public, out of the population, arises out of what people can contribute, their own credits, essentially, in such a system of what they have to offer, because it obviously builds community. So there's a role for this kind of thing. What exactly the role is in our present circumstances is hard to know. But I think it's important to keep this in mind. And finally, the one thing I would also say in closing, before I turn it over to Phil for the real closing remarks, is that we can all take steps in the way we deal with money every day, and I think all of you are familiar with these kinds of steps. They're common sense steps, but sometimes it's easy for people to lose track of them. It's obvious that we should avoid unnecessary debt. And I would say especially all credit card debt, because credit card debt is a debt that carries the highest interest and goes directly into the banking system that perpetrates that system. But there is legitimate debt in buying houses and other things. So the idea of borrowing and lending is not wrong. It's just something that, matter of fact, it's important in gluing a community together, how we lend and borrow to each other. So lending and borrowing needs to be done, but it needs to be done thoughtfully and carefully and with other people's interests in mind. One can bank with local banks or credit unions rather than sending your money to Wall Street. That's a simple thing that you can do. I was pleased to find out that our county government had shifted its account from Chase Bank to Hocking Valley Bank, a local bank in town. But the third thing is just self-education through further exploration, so that the national and global monetary system can be changed to serve the needs of people everywhere in ways consistent with our values. Let's have a moment of silence here, and then Phil, when you're ready to follow up with what you want to say, go ahead, and then we can have some open time for additional input.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Again, thank you for joining us in this session. It is notably a privilege and an honor to be with you again. Before I switch over to screen share, I want to add a little story that complements John Howell's presentation, and it has to do with our neighbor to the north, Canada. Canada had from 1938 to 1972 its own national bank. That is to say, the Canadian government owned the bank with which it did its business and the bank it relied upon to introduce money into the economy. And the Treasury of Canada benefited greatly from that. It allowed the Canadian government to create the transnational railway, build the St. Lawrence Freeway, fund its national health system, organize a system of colleges and regional universities, and a number of other public benefits. And then under a neoconservative government in 1972, it decided that it should follow a recommendation coming out of a committee in Basel, Switzerland, and start doing its business with a privately held central bank. Its national debt went from zero to a very large number very quickly and has continued to go up at an exponential rate. So there's an interesting story there and an interesting example nearby that reinforces many of the thoughts that John Howell shared. Now let me see if I can go to screen share. Now this looks good. All right. There should be a way to expand this so that you can see the whole thing, right? Well, I don't know how that's done, so we'll just leave it at that.
I think you're supposed to push play.
Oh, yes, but I have a black bar in front of that. Now it's revealed. Okay, terrific. My task here is to consider some possible directions moving forward. This task has in many ways taken forward some of the thoughts that John has already shared with things that we can do, large and small, to feed the system less energetically. But this task is also resolved into a effort to more clearly define the risks that arise in the current circumstances and the kinds of competitions that are presently afoot in the money system and what this means going forward. So let's get started and see what we can do. Mackenzie King, Canadian Prime Minister, both before and after the Great Depression, had this to say, and I think it's a very appropriate way to begin this discussion. Once a nation parts with the control of its currency and credit, it matters not who makes the national laws. Usury, once in control, will wreck any nation. Until the control of the issue of currency and credit is restored to government and recognized as its most sacred responsibility, all talk of sovereignty, of parliament, and of democracy is idle and futile. An individual who knew from vast experience what this system what damage and what risks this system incurred. Let's start with an agenda schedule of what we can conclude from our efforts so far. First, it seems increasingly clear that change is necessary and imminent, yet of indeterminate form. We are in a period of flux. There are currently and will be in the future multiple options and parallel systems in play. Don't look for a single solution. There's no silver bullet to this problem. Major change will be strenuously opposed. The current system is deeply embedded and powerfully committed to maintaining the privileges that it currently enjoys. Vigilance and advocacy are of utmost importance. And collective action will be required for significant improvements. We face three major forces competing for our future. Private banks, we've been discussing quite a bit. Cryptocurrencies and the democratic state are also actively in play. Private banks, of course, create the vast bulk of our money, and newly created money makes banks more profitable, concentrates wealth, inflates asset bubbles, induces systemic monetary instability, and requires periodic bank bailouts. Cryptocurrencies are newer to this game. It uses new technology to create money and to manage payments. Its launch into the world has been a bit chaotic and very unstable, but it's quite clear that it continues to have large potential and may eventually dominate worldwide payment systems. That would then concentrate vast knowledge and wealth into those who manage cryptocurrency systems. Knowledge about everyone's spending patterns, which would lead to intimate knowledge about their lives, their interests, and their capacities. And of course, the democratic state could, should it be willing, it could create new money digitally that would be stable, that would create profits for public use, and that would benefit the public good. Now, as these three competitors do battle with one another, it's clear that a great deal is at risk. Here's a short schedule of what I mean. Our future economic prosperity is at risk because it very significantly depends upon which of these three broad options tends to dominate. Well, I noticed I have question marks, so I would say, is it possible that our economic prosperity will be at risk? Is it possible that viable democracies are also at risk? There seems to be strong evidence to suggest that democracies are not compatible with our current money and banking system. Oh, let me interject at this point. John has the pattern of arguing that our money system is very simple and simply has to do with the creation of money. And I define the problem just a bit more broadly because I like to talk about our money and banking system, and I like to include the way in which banks subsequently distribute the money that they create by making business-based decisions as to who gets loans, who doesn't, and to those who do, under what terms, and how frequently should those terms not be met the obligation turned over and refinanced. But back to this question of what is at risk. I say that because of the way in which the banking system works, it threatens the possibility of equitable societies. So should that system continue in play, it's quite likely that equitability within our society will continue to be jeopardized. How about biological diversity and ecosystem stability? Are they at risk? And a sustainable future? These are things we can talk about. I think these are things that are important to keep in mind. My general sense is that the risks are very, very large and very high. We're not talking about events that are very rare, but have huge consequences. We're talking about systems that will be in place or are currently in place and impose substantial risks on a daily basis. So then what can we do? Of course, we can support Q's efforts to educate. And I think importantly, we can encourage advocacy at and by the Friends Committee on National Legislation regarding these issues. We can seek out local and public bank advocacy groups. In fact, there are a number of very strongly organized public bank advocacy groups that have, in the case of California, successfully passed some legislation allowing municipalities to get into this game. And there are a number of other states and localities engaged in the process of studying what could be done to have a plethora of state public banks. Regions could do this as well. One could imagine the Appalachian Regional Commission establishing a public bank. One of our own board members has actively advocated for a public bank for, was it Nova Scotia, New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. There is a bill in Congress called the National Infrastructure Bank Act. It would create a public bank for purposes focused on infrastructure. These initiatives all require a substantial level of advocacy, and those are encouraged greatly. We can also work with our meetings, Adult Education Committee, to put these questions on an education agenda locally. We can bank at local banks and credit unions. We can reduce household debt to large banks and to credit companies. And finally, we can vote, talk, tell stories, advocate, and donate as if this were the only important issue, because it is. Thank you. Let us move now into spirit-led questions, clarifications, rebuttals, and comments received out of the silence.
When this country was founded, it was founded on principles of freedom and future. There was a big, this is to the best of my understanding and what's coming through me. And that concept of, oh, we're going to, that this future that we have is and that's why we've moved to this country. And it's interesting that our monetary system would be based on that value of future, that concept of future in the form of debt. It's like, that's what's valuable. This fact that we're going to succeed, it's going to be even better in the future. And that the monetary system is based on that as the value. But that leads us into the trap of that we basically leveraged that future in the process of this loan and debt system. And for that reason, I'm extremely fascinated by the community-led exchange systems, like the one that the video, John's presentation showed a video of the community-based exchange, looking at resources, looking at an exchange system based on production. What has a person contributed to the community, and then being issued, X number of coins, based on that production, and then they can use that for mutual exchange. So what value is it that we would like our currency to be based on? That's a question for me.
Camilla, thank you for that. I think that what's in my mind and heart speaks to the value and comes from, I believe it was Thomas Berry, who I first was introduced to the concept and the thinking that our economy, quite obviously, is born off of the ecological economy. We cannot consider our own the human economy outside of the ecological economy or community. And when I was an undergrad, I studied in Costa Rica, and part of the effort of those studies was to determine a monetary value of what was being lost with the destruction of forest. And there was, some conflict around, like, how do we put a dollar sign on forest, on life? How do we set a value for this when it's priceless? Ultimately, I think we're dealing with, life itself is priceless. Our health is priceless. There are things that we mustn't compromise on in terms of health and longevity and life and future. And so thinking future, right now we're dealing with illness and debt and all sorts of things that are arising from, and I apologize, I missed yesterday's session looking at the costs of the monetary system that we've had and are living with at this time. But I'm curious to see, and I imagine this was 20 some years ago that I studied, actually, yeah, over 20 years ago that I studied in Costa Rica. And so there's a lot of work that's been done since that time. And I'm curious if there has been a valuation of the debt that humanity owes the planet based on the loss of biodiversity and the shift in climate that we've seen. I would love to see those numbers, and then look at our lending and our creation of money based on that debt, right? So a debt that really takes into account the debt that is owed both other species and cultures and communities that have been sacrificed and some exterminated to continue the monetary system as it is. And really, anyone who's sitting and listening to this talk, it's certainly, we've benefited off of the loss of species and cultures and communities. I imagine that few of us here today are totally immune to having benefited and continuing to benefit from the current system. So that's something to put out there. I'm not sure if it's been considered by the group, but I'd love to hear more on that piece.
I'm confused as to how costs and inflation work in a system where the government creates money and spends it into the public. How do you set costs, and how do you treat inflation if there's some conflicts somehow? I'm talking about costs for groceries and other services. That's what I'm talking about.
I'm a little reluctant to take us out of a worshipful mode and into a discursive mode. But that's a question that I think many people have. I have two approaches to that question. This was an issue in the American colonies before the Revolution. Each colony had a board of governors. The board of governors issued script, typically as loans with collateralized by land. If they issued script money into the colony, into that colony, at a rate that was appropriate given its demographic increase and its economic expansion, that script would have a stable value. Pennsylvania and Massachusetts were well regarded for the stability of their colonial script. South Carolina was not so disciplined. It issued more money than was appropriate. And so South Carolinians ran around trying to spend that money on goods and services that were not yet in existence. And of course, that meant that those things that could be bought increased in price. And typically inflation is the result of too much money in circulation within the economy. And so South Carolina's script was known as having an unstable and slowly declining value. Should we consider some response to this question under a proposed government, under a proposed public banking system? The question would be, at what rate would money be spent into the economy? And this is a very helpful question. It brings up the dilemma that occurred during World War II with respect to how to keep things from being inflated when so much of the nation's energy was diverted from the production of consumer goods over to the production of military goods, while at the same time it was paying lots of wages out to people who were doing all the work. And those wages certainly wanted to go somewhere. And if they went into consumption, prices would increase. One of the solutions was to encourage the public to buy war bonds. And that absorbed an important portion of the excess money that was being pumped into the society. The other solution was to tax that money back away. So we've often heard that during the Eisenhower administration, the top marginal tax rate was 92%. Well, that was put in place in the post-war period in order to absorb the excess money that had been pumped into the society during the nation's war efforts. So this would be the function of a, I guess you have to call them a council of monetary advisors, who would examine carefully the demographic and economic situation within the nation and among its regions, and make sure that the money being spent into society did not exceed the capacity of that society to produce those goods and services. And if that condition were met, we wouldn't have a problem with inflation. Now, of course, today's banking system necessarily produces a low level of inflation all the time. This is the Fed's 2% inflation rate, which is its target rate. And it's pleased not to go below that. And if it does go to below that, it's going to pump more money into society, into the economy. So I think the basic answer to your question, Elizabeth, and it's a profound question, is that ever so long as the amount of money that is let into circulation within the economy, in the case we're considering by government spending, or taken out of the economy by government taxes, or deferred into the future by savings, as long as that balance is achieved, inflation will not be a problem.
Thank you.
I would like to add that this problem of inflation is certainly an absolutely vital one. And it's often said, as Phil has said, that it's related to the amount of money in circulation compared to the capacity of the economy to use it. And there's certainly truth in that. I think it's there are other factors involved with inflation as well. When we push the limits of the planet in terms of providing us with resources, either agriculturally or in terms of raw materials, they get harder and harder to get and harder to produce, their prices go up. So it's because of a limiting supply while you have an increasing demand. And that's independent of the money supply. It's another independent factor. Both of these factors are at work. And we've seen other factors associated with inflation, and that is in the marketplace, the opportunity that corporations have had to raise prices, in part because of lack of effective competition, but in any case, taking advantage of the increases in demand to increase prices when for things like medicines and so on, whereas their costs haven't necessarily gone up, but they increase the prices, and it's the profits go into the corporate sector. So you're absolutely right to be concerned about this inflation, and we have it, as Phil pointed out, in our current system. It's built in, and so in a shifting to money production by government, that would have to be something that is attended to. And basically, the kind of legislation that has been developed acknowledges that need to have an independent organization within government to essentially advise Congress is how much money they can spend, because with government creation of money, basically the whatever deficits there are between revenues and expenses would be made up by increased money creation, by new money. And that would have to be guarded against to make sure that it did not become excessive and outstrip the economy to use it. I would also like to say that the source of growth of money has always been the productivity of its people. The people produce more, and therefore there's a greater demand for the medium of exchange. So out of that comes the idea that the need for new money comes out of the people, and the people should be the prime benefit of that, not the private sector. And so that's one of the arguments, essentially, to think about the rightness of public creation of money. But public institutions are human institutions, and they're not perfect. We know that for sure, and bad things can happen. And we hope that in a continuing democracy, that some kind of a truth can abide. But we know that it's a rough course. But thanks for the question. It's important.
Yeah, I'd like to, well, before I move on to the other part, I'd like to echo Meg's concern in terms of the fact that we're addressing the extractive aspects of whatever structures we have right now in terms of economic structures. We're not necessarily recognizing that, you know, what it's doing to Earth in terms of, it's not just what humans are producing, it's what they're using to produce. And that, we call it, I don't know, there was one guy was, I forgot his name right now, he's talking about cradle to cradle and the understanding of full cost accounting that tracks it from when it comes out of the ground, and that's not, I don't see that yet quite. The other concern I had was there's a sense of trust in government. When the Constitution was developed, it was in the context of responding to a monarchy, and the thought would be that this would be better. And people were not taken care of at that time. I mean, you had to have land, and you had to be a white male, and you had to be free, and so forth. And life has changed. And that if we put the control at this time back into government, it has moved away. What's the government that we're talking about? The concern we have right now, in many ways, is that this government, by both right and left, are not well trusted, and for good reason. The bailout that Obama created was based not on the FDIC taking over the banks and bailing out the mortgages and letting people have houses. It was bailing out the banks at the upper end and allowing CEOs to have the millions and millions. So there was a lack of trust there in terms of how that functioned. And those were laws that were available currently. The FDIC could have gone in and stepped in and taken over those banks, and they didn't. And so I'm not convinced that the way is through government, or at least in the current structure of the way the government is.
There are a couple of questions on the table here I'd like to speak to. The example of Greece during the most recent depression beginning in 2008 is very instructive because it raises the opposite question. What about deflation? Greece got into a great amount of debt to foreign creditors, and the IMF basically refused to refloat those loans. And a lot of money was sucked out of the Greek economy in order to accommodate mostly European banking houses that held Greek debt. And the extent to which money was sucked out of the Greek economy, it caused a massive amount of unemployment. There simply wasn't enough money to keep that economy going. One of the interesting responses is that a number of localities started to issue their own money. They basically launched local money systems, and that was part of the response. Now, this is not something that's unique to Greece and at that particular point in time, because poor nations around the world are coping with very substantial levels of debt. And they can't ignore that debt because their currencies aren't used for international commerce, as is ours. So they're in a very vulnerable position. They're really not in charge of their own economies nor their own polities, because the level of debt puts them at the mercy of international bankers. The question of natural resource consumption is very directly linked to the questions that we have been talking about regarding money and banking. Of course, we'll hear from George Lakey later on, and he has some interesting experience trying to dissuade the Pennsylvania National Bank from continuing its financing of mountaintop removal by selected coal companies. So it's quite clear that banks can be dissuaded from underwriting extraordinarily damaging extractive practices. But there's another dimension to it at a more macroeconomic scale. I think we once said that each year the economy has to produce enough money to not only pay the loans back that are outstanding, but also to pay the interest on those loans. And the only way it can do that is to grow. It can grow in labor productivity. It can grow in increased industrial activity, or it can grow in natural resource extraction. That gets right to Elizabeth's question. The banking system itself necessitates various forms of growth, and one of the more accessible forms is just to dig stuff up in the earth and to overburden the earth. And it's really part of the macroeconomic consequences of the monetary system we have today. The issue of functionality and trust is an important issue to introduce. Thank you, Brad. The last major bailout occurred at the very juncture when government was at its weakest, during a transition from the Bush administration to the Obama administration. At that very juncture in time, no government was really capable of either implementing or understanding the consequences of the options in front of it. It was very easy for the banking community to persuade it to bail those dysfunctional banks out and put them back in business under the threat they would take down the whole economy if they didn't do so otherwise. So that particular historic event occurred at a time of enormous vulnerability to our governmental systems. And I think you can say that our current governmental dysfunctionality is in fact functional. That is to say, there are deeply embedded interests in society that are happy to see our government not work. Because if it worked, it might actually be effective in solving some of the problems, and that would mean regulations, including regulations of banking and finance. Which, of course, these deeply entrenched interests wish not to see. So, yes, I would suggest that governmental dysfunctionality and governmental trust are not inherent to governments. They've been manufactured. You want some counterexamples? Consider Finland, consider New Zealand. There are places around the world where governments actually work. And they're trustworthy. Back to everyone else.
So
One
friends,
might
we're at the-
also,
friends, we're at the time where we need to bring to a close this session. But there will be interest group times where people can exchange further. In bringing it to a close, I would just like to pause for a moment of silence to just invite us all to savor and try and deepen in the sense in which there's really spiritual concerns that are at stake in all this. Often with policy questions, especially ones that can get as technical as this, it can get us to obscure the way in which fundamentally the system that we trust in and use to exchange things as well as information with each other is the way we frame our world and the meanings in it. And the question as to how we try to ground that ultimately in truth, in the sense in which early Quakers talked about the truth that has come to teach us all, can get lost. So I would just invite us, for me, it would be helpful, and I invite everyone else to just take a moment to maybe savor the question as to the spiritual significance of all this in our individual and collective lives before we take a break.